So I want to welcome everybody here to the inaugural Barbara D. Day Lecture. Yes, thank you. It's so exciting to see so many members of our school and campus communities, our alumni, our educators, and so many more who are gathered here today. This lecture series was created by Professor Emerita Barbara D. Day, whose distinguished career and enduring commitment to the school and education have shaped generations of educators and scholars. I'm going to let Barbara stand and say hello for a moment before I tell you about her wonderful career. Thank you, Barbara, and welcome. You have to do it right up close.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here today and to be here for this event, but I'm most excited to see my students. You know, they've come from many years back, and it's so good to be with them. Also, I want to thank Dean Jill and Robin and Laurie and all the people in the development office who have put this event together. We really do appreciate that. And I'm delighted that we have Professor Dan here, because he's from UVA and his research is very much the kind of research that I like and been involved in as well. So you're going to enjoy him. Thanks for coming from Virginia.
Thank you.
They're our good neighbors, you know.
Yes, I'm aware.
Basketball, every now and then we have concerns about that.
We can talk about that later. We can talk about that later.
So thank you all for coming, and enjoy the day. Have a good time. Welcome back to Carolina. And for me, it's just been wonderful in this early morning meeting, seeing my students and taking pictures with them and reminding us of all sorts of good things. Have a wonderful day and welcome to Carolina.
I know many of our alumni are here because of Dr. Day, and I actually had the pleasure of coming to Carolina in 1999 when Dr. Day was still on the faculty. So I know her from those years that we overlapped, and I know of her accomplished career, but let me tell you a little bit about that for those of you who don't know. So at Carolina, Dr. Day was the chair of curriculum and instruction. She taught doctoral courses in supervision and research in curriculum and instruction, and she coordinated several programs. She authored numerous textbooks and conducted research to identify what teachers and curriculum heads want and need to be successful. Through her generosity, this series is designed to bridge educational research and exemplary practice, to enrich the academic life of the school and the university, and to spark dialogue around innovation in education. We are deeply grateful to Dr. Day for making this possible for our school, whose faculty's individual brilliance has the power to be a collective engine that outpaces the challenges of education and accelerates the future of learning. It is especially fitting that we launch this series with Dr. Daniel Willingham, a leading cognitive psychology researcher and professor at the University of Virginia, as Dr. Day had introduced, where he's been a faculty member since 1992. Until about 2000, Dr. Willingham's research focused solely on the brain basis of learning and memory. Today, all of his research concerns the application of cognitive psychology to K-16 education. He is the author of several books, including the best-selling Why Don't Students Like School? And most recently, Outsmart Your Brain. In 2017, he was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve as a member of the National Board for Education Sciences. Dr. Willingham's scholarship has had an extraordinary influence on how educators think about learning, memory, and classroom practice. And he is widely lauded for his ability to translate research into insights that genuinely matter for schools and for teachers and for students. Today's lecture, Improving the Use of Psychological Science in K-12 Education, speaks directly to Dr. Day's goal for this lecture and the work of our School of Education to connect rigorous research with real-world practice that benefits schools, educators, and most importantly, learners. Dr. Willingham, we are so honored to welcome you to Carolina, and we are very grateful that you accepted to be our very first speaker for the Barbara D. Day Lecture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Willingham.
Well, thanks so much for that kind introduction. Thank you all very much for giving me a little bit of your time this morning. I would be honored to be asked to come to Carolina under any circumstances, and to the School of Education in particular, but to be asked to come to on a day that's honoring Dr. Day is really something quite special for me. So I feel really pleased to be here. So I was just thinking, like, I hope this isn't the pinnacle. Like, I hope the talk goes okay. But that's for you to decide. So here's where I want to start. This is a face that may be familiar to a handful of you. This is George Miller, who's a well-known cognitive psychologist, and he was also president of the American Psychological Association in 1969. And his presidential address that year became famous in a way that APA presidential addresses almost never do. He talked about giving psychology away, and this came to be a phrase that was often repeated within psychology, that this is something we should all aspire to. He was saying, we actually know some stuff as psychologists, and yet we're not really being forthcoming enough to make known what we know. And that really hit home to me. As Jill said, I started my life as a basic scientist and really was not involved in education at all until the early 2000s. This is Nashville. And I was invited to Nashville to give a talk to about 500 teachers. And I rashly agreed to do this, even though I quite well knew I really didn't know anything about classrooms at all. And as often happens after you've agreed to give a talk, when you're on the verge of giving the talk, you think, my God, why did I agree to give this talk? And so I quite literally, I'd been teaching an Introduction to Cognitive Psychology course already by then for 10 or 15 years. So I just sort of plucked some stuff out of the course that I thought was kind of interesting and that I hoped maybe applied to classrooms. This turned out to be a turning point of my career, because what I was astonished to find was teachers didn't already know this stuff. The stuff that was in the very first course, if you go to University of Virginia, in sort of learning and attention and all that, the first course you would take, that content they were not familiar with. And so I thought about George Miller, because I thought, my field is doing a terrible job of giving psychology away. Or possibly we're trying to give it away and teachers are saying, thanks very much, I'm good. And so I got interested in getting to the bottom of that. And so that's the issue that I want to take up today. And here's an outline of my remarks. First, I want to highlight that there are different ways that teachers might make use of what psychologists know, and I'm only going to talk about one particular feature of that, so I want to set that up first. Second, I want to describe why I think we might have a problem in giving away that aspect of psychology, and then I will offer a solution, and we'll get to the fourth. The fourth will become more clear as we go. So let's start here, how K-12 educators can use psychological science. So psychology is a basic science. We're in the business of describing how people think, what motivates them, why they experience emotions in different circumstances, and so on. One way that an applied science, or the potential of an applied science like education, can use basic science is that the findings from basic science can inspire materials and practices. So, for example, behaviorism famously inspired the idea of reward systems that you can set up in classrooms. Now, whether you think this is a good idea or a terrible idea, it was pretty directly inspired by these findings from basic science. So that's one thing, one way you can draw on basic science gives you new ideas about practices and materials that can be used in classrooms. A second way that basic science is useful is it has provided ways of thinking about evaluating interventions in classrooms, practices in classrooms. So for example, accelerated reader, as you might be familiar with, is one of their claims is that this children in classrooms that use accelerated reader are more motivated to read. Same claim is made by Pizza Hut Book It program. I know that some of you are familiar with that. For those of you who are not, it's basically a marketing scam to get kids to drag their parents to Pizza Hut because they get a free pizza that's about that big, and then the parents have to buy. But the claim is that they earn these free pizzas by reading books. And so the claim of Pizza Hut is like this is a reading motivation program. So neither one of these was inspired by basic science at all. Somebody just thought it was a good idea. And there are lots of things that happens in classrooms that are not inspired by basic science, but people feel like they have an intuition, this is a good idea. And so we have methods and statistics developed within our science that can help people more realistically evaluate whether or not these practices do what we're hoping they're going to do. I want to focus on a third function or way that basic science can help, illustrated by a conversation I had with the daughter of a friend of mine. She had recently become a teacher. It was now something like November, and she was a first grade teacher. And I asked her, how's it going? She said, kind of better than I thought. I said, did you feel like your program well prepared you for what you faced in the classroom? She said, for the most part, but they didn't tell me what to do about a spinner. And I felt for her. But I think this is emblematic of the challenge that we face in trying to prepare teachers, is we obviously can't prepare them for everything. Right? Things are going to happen and that are outside of anything that anyone might predict. And these sorts of practices, like there are particular circumstances where we say, this is a useful practice in these circumstances and so on. But then you get a spinner, you have to wing it. Right? You've got to you can't just say, look, little girl, I didn't have a seminar on spinners, and so you just need to knock it off, right? You have to somehow respond in a way that is going to be helpful. And so we can predict that the way you respond in the moment is going to be heavily influenced by your beliefs about how children learn, what motivates them, what their motivational lives and so on are like. In other words, everybody has a mental model of a learner. And this is the third way that basic science can contribute. Basic science can contribute with a mental model of the learner in teacher candidates that is informed by findings from basic science. So we do have empirical evidence that practitioners have this. This is no surprise. This is basically beliefs about what kids are like. They've got these beliefs before they enter their teacher education programs. There's good evidence that their beliefs are changed by what they learn in teacher education programs, and it's also changed by their experience. Right, so our goal is that educators will have a mental model of how children learn that's informed by psychological science. Right? So that's sort of teeing up the particular corner of this relationship between basic science and applied science that I want to consider. Why we might have a problem. So I had this experience in Nashville where I felt like there was stuff that I kind of thought teachers would know that the teachers in front of me did not know. What sort of evidence do we have, both about the extent to which teachers are exposed to this content that would be helpful in building this mental model, and then the extent to which they're actually absorbing it, remembering it, using it, and so on. The truth is our data are pretty limited. So it's really hard to generalize about what teacher candidates are learning. There are thousands of programs, right? And so saying in American education, like teachers are prepared this way in terms of what they're learning about educational psychology, you really can't make a blanket statement like that. I'm kind of going to anyway, which is that I think for the most part, and David Berliner agreed in 1993, for the most part, most programs include a course in educational psychology or a course in foundations that includes a pretty sizable chunk of educational psychology. So I think it is the case that most of the time, most teacher candidates are exposed to this content at some point. In terms of what they know, again, data are really pretty bad. When I first got interested in this problem, I was sure there were going to be terrific data. There were going to be surveys where someone had simply asked teachers about sort of stuff about how children learn. It really doesn't exist. There have been researchers who are interested in the extent to which teachers believe myths. And that's been especially popular in the last 5 years or so. So this is an example of some myths, learning styles, that dyslexia means seeing letters backwards and so on. I mentioned this study. This is from 2017, so it's getting a little old. But this included like several thousand members of the general public as well as educators. So it's a little broader than many of these studies. But most of these studies show the same pattern, which is pretty discouraging, which is, at least when it comes to belief in myths, educators are not really where we would want them to be. So actually, before I get to this, let me just point out. So I'm trying to convince you that there's a problem, and I'm saying like the extent to which they're really supposed to learn this content, we don't really know. The extent to which they know this content, we don't really know. But I'm going to carry on as if my point has been made. But don't leave. The rest is going to be great, I promise. I think another thing that is telling, and this is, again, a study that's a little old, but I haven't seen anything more recent that tries to get at the same issue. So this was a survey of teachers who belong to the American Federation of Teachers, and asked them, among many other things, what they thought about their teacher education, how well it prepared them, and so on. And the modal response was captured here. They said it wasn't real, it was intellectually stimulating. They liked it. They had a positive regard for what they had learned, but they felt like it wasn't a very high utility. It was more intellectual. And so, it kind of gave me a background of what my profession is about, but it was really too theoretical for it to be applied. Okay, so this is all, again, the data are not where I wish they were, but I'm going to carry on as if we have a problem. Well, I could say more about that. I could tell you more anecdotes, but let's leave it here. All right. Here's why. What I'm going to do now is tell you why I think we've got this problem and what I think we might do about it. What I'm going to do is, a lot of times, and I'm certainly not the first person to address the question, what is it we want teachers to know about how children learn when they go into practice? Other people have taken this up. I'm treating it in a different way than others have. They're usually sort of focused on concrete phenomena and things that, statements of fact that they think teachers ought to know. What I want to focus on is the type of statements that scientists make and their usefulness to scientists, and then contrast that with their usefulness to practitioners. So the core of the argument that I'm going to make is that teachers are exposed to this content, but it is framed to them the way a researcher would frame it. Essentially, beginning teachers are treated like, or teachers who are in their programs, are treated as though they are beginning researchers, rather than as if they are people who are going to go into practice. And researchers and practitioners need different things from these basic scientific findings. All right, that's the setup. So here's how we're going to get to this. I'm going to highlight there are 3 different types of statements that scientists deal with. One are just observations of the world. Right? So if you're a scientist, your starting point is you're noticing, you think, some consistencies in the world. Then you develop a theory that tries to capture those observations in a small set of statements. And then you may or may not recognize there are epistemic assumptions that underlie this theory. You inevitably make some assumptions about, in the case of education, you make some assumptions about what knowledge really is, what it really means to learn something, and so on. These are often unexamined by researchers, but they are always present. So what I'm going to suggest is all three of these are very important for researchers, and they ought to be thinking about all of them. They are not all useful to practitioners. And the observations in particular are useful to practitioners. That's the way we can prepare teachers in ways that will make use of science, that they will actually find helpful. Okay, so the first thing, let me start by talking about observations. When I say observations, a more precise term would really be empirical generalization. So these are findings that are observed across contexts, across ages, across materials, and so on. These are very, very robust consistencies in the way that humans learn, or humans deploy attention, or humans react emotionally, and so on. Right? Once it starts to get really particular and there are lots of interactions, we probably lose interest. This is probably not something that we want to tell teachers. We want things where you get big effects and it's very, very consistent. These exist. All right? You might initially say, like, what in the world, that sounds great, Dan, but are there any of them? There are actually a bunch of them. So these are some examples. Practice is crucial to gaining expertise. Right? Probing memory improves retention. Only the attended aspect of an experience will be learned. Sleep improves retention. Memory for context is more fragile than memory for content. Learning curves are negatively accelerating. Right? And notice that all of these are, I mean, you could, if you adhere to one theory or another, you would phrase these differently, but these are all just observations about how humans behave in particular circumstances. So those are empirical generalizations. We could add some other things. So like the suggestion is, and we'll get to this, seems like it would be weird, like teachers should know this. Teachers should know sleep improves retention, right? They should, in addition to not believing myths, they should know the positive stuff that we actually do know, right? That's the suggestion. In addition to something that is true across contexts and so forth, it really ought to hold the promise of some application in the classroom. So this is another very, very consistent finding. Subjects can identify a relatively large number of stimuli, like 20 or more, after a very brief exposure, say 50 milliseconds, but forgetting of this information is rapid. It was first discovered in the 1950s. It's extremely consistent. I don't know what in the world a teacher would do with this, so I can't see much reason for them to be aware of it. The other thing that I think is desirable is that there be a consequential effect size associated with it. We want to teach teachers things where, like, if you know this and you try and deploy it, you'll get some bang for your buck. So mood-dependent memory is probably true. There's been lots of debates about this. I think it's probably right. So that means, like, if you're feeling happy when you learn something, it's easier to recall it when you're feeling happy than when you're feeling sad. That's probably right, but the effect size is really small, right? It's probably around 0.10 or 0.15 or something like that. So you're not really, there's also like a little unclear exactly how teachers would, like, say, make kids sad because they were sad when they learned. Like, you hated learning this, so I'm going to make you angry again when, so it's going to help, right? Okay. So this is the first thing. I think there's obvious utility in teachers learning observations. Now, when you look at that list of things, it seems crazy, like the idea that teachers are going to learn this laundry list of observations. And it feels like that's what theories are for, right? So here's some other empirical generalizations. The amount of information that can be kept in mind simultaneously is limited. This limitation has consequences for a broad variety of problem-solving situations. This limitation varies across individuals. Verbal auditory information is very hard to ignore. There are a bunch of other things. This is all out of this model. This is Alan Badley's working memory model. So the question is, why would you get people to memorize a laundry list of stuff when you could teach them the theory? And the theory brings it all together and helps it be cohere and be more memorable and understandable. There are two problems with teaching theory. The first is that theories tend to be pretty abstract and difficult to understand. This isn't a deal breaker, But like if you're really going to try and get to this, so this part's easy. This is like auditory imagery. This is like hearing a sound in your inner ear. This is visual imagery. This is seeing something in your mind's eye. This is neither one. This is an abstract code, and it's hard to wrap your mind around. And lots of psychological theories have that property, that they're not so, you need to spend some time with them. You need to sit with them and study them before they really hang together. So not a deal breaker, but like increases the apparent cost of asking teacher candidates to learn this. The second thing I'm much more concerned about, which is that theories go beyond the data, always. Right? So an example, this is the contemporary theory of working memory. This is the theory of working memory when it was first proposed in 1974. So there are things that are wrong with this theory. It made predictions that turned out not to be true. One of the predictions was this element and this element do not communicate directly and can't. They have to go through this. Okay, the architecture you can see here is different. There's this one and this one. Here's what that circle was. Now there's this new guy in between, right? The details are not that important. What I want to emphasize is if you taught this to teacher candidates in 1974, you were teaching them something that was in part wrong. And if you teach people a scientific theory, almost certainly it's going to be wrong for that reason. Right? Theories must go beyond the data. I want to point out that this indicates that there are a lot of theorists, I would say, I'm not really sure I see the utility in teaching teachers the works of these theories. So this is from the Principles of Learning and Teaching section of the Praxis. And this is like if you're preparing for it, this is telling you what you need to know, and you need to know Bandura and Brunner, Dewey, Piaget, Vygotsky. These theories are decades old, right? So when we talk about teaching students these theories, think about what textbooks look like. They tell you what Piaget is, and then there's 2 or 3 pages sort of saying, here's all of the ways in which we now know Piaget wasn't quite right. Right? And the same thing is true of Brunner, the same thing is true of Vygotsky, and so on. Is that of high value to teachers as they're preparing to be practitioners? I can understand why, if you're going to be a researcher, someone might say, I think there's value in your knowing the sort of big arc of where our field has been and where it's come from. It's much harder for me to see the utility for a practitioner to know the background of these theories that have since been replaced. Okay, so theory, I think, is not going to help. Put a pin in that because I'm going to come back and say a different type of theory would be helpful. Finally, epistemic assumptions. And this is, I think, the source of much mischief in teacher education, or if not, probably not education, but, well, possibly education. All right, so epistemic assumptions refers to background assumptions. So these are pre-theoretical. Before you even sit down to create a theory, you are going to have to plant your flag and make some assumptions about some of the contents of your theory. For example, if you're writing a theory about learning, you have to decide what it means to learn something, right? Or what it means to know something. So most educational psychology textbooks and courses will introduce students to 3 different sets of epistemic assumptions. One is associated with behaviorism, where they will learn that the behaviorists characterize knowledge as relationships among observable variables. Second is information processing, where knowledge is characterized as symbols and processes operating on symbols. And finally, situated cognition, where knowledge is embedded in a social and physical context. I want to point out, epistemic assumptions are very, very broad, and they place only very, very loose constraints on theory. So you take behaviorism, Guthrie and Skinner did not agree at all, had very, very different visions of, or very different theories that operated in quite different ways, but they're both behaviorists. Same thing is true of information processing. Same thing is true of situated cognition. So you're not you're saying less than you think you are in a way when you make your epistemic assumptions. The mischief part is that epistemic assumptions, if you're not careful, sound a lot like empirical generalizations. It sounds like you're saying that something is actually already kind of known. So here's an example. Learning is social, right, which every teacher has heard many, many times. This is an epistemic assumption and could mean lots of different things. Right? So for example, it might mean that learning is social in that the social environment provides opportunities for learning or possibly impediments to learning. One way that would cash out in a classroom is if the kid sitting next to you is well prepared and has a sense of themselves as a kid who succeeds in school, that kid is probably going to ask interesting questions. That kid's going to be on task. If the kid sitting next to you has a history of not being engaged in school, they're going to be a distraction, right? So that's one way of thinking about learning as social. Another way of thinking about learning as social is quite different, which is to say that all knowledge is socially constructed, meaning that my perception of the world, the way I put together my experience, is informed in part by my social identity. Right? So that's another way that we could say, yes, learning is social, but it's obviously completely different than the first way of conceptualizing it. A third way of conceptualizing it is that learning is best conceived as knowledge and learning, really knowledge that is distributed across social networks. So for example, don't think of knowledge as just something that lives between your ears. You are also a social being. You have access to knowledge that other people have if you have close social ties to them, right? So if you don't know anything about physics, but your spouse is a physicist, you have very ready access to knowledge about physics. So couldn't we say, in some sense, you know physics better than someone whose spouse is not a physicist, right? That's a third way of thinking about learning as social. The mischief part is learning as social is frequently interpreted to mean children learn best in social situations. That's an empirical generalization. That is not true. Right? But if you think that this is true, and again, this is a very weak statement because it can mean lots of things, and the constraint it places on theories is if your theory says nothing about social stuff, your theory is missing something important because learning is inherently social. That's all this is claiming. And then it can be taken to mean something much more specific and actually something that really has quite direct implications for the classroom. Right, so that's my concern with epistemic assumptions, and that's why it gets a big red X. All right, so question regarding what should go into the model. What should we focus on? What do we want teachers to really absorb about educational psychology? The answer, I think, is empirical generalizations. This is generalizations about what kids are actually like in school-like situations. But I want to turn to this idea about theories. So theories got a big red X also, and that was dealing with the theories that researchers develop. And I want to suggest that there's another way of thinking about this. Researchers and practitioners put theories to different uses. I mentioned researchers want a theory that does a better job than existing theories of accounting for data and that generates new predictions, right? I especially emphasize this part, that it has to generate new predictions if for a scientist to think that this theory is interesting at all. That's not what practitioners need at all. Practitioners want a theory that integrates existing empirical generalizations, thereby making them understandable and memorable, right? It's very valid what I was saying before. Like, here are all these factoids about working memory. why would you memorize a list of something when it seems much easier to learn a theory and then you can kind of derive all the factoids, even if you don't derive them. It coordinates them, it makes them more understandable. So that's a very, very different purpose and requires a different type of theory. The type of theory practitioners need is going to look quite different than what researchers need. Right? So this is point one. Researchers expect theories to compete. And again, if you look at materials that are typically used in teacher education, they're usually introduced to different perspectives on the same topic. So these are different models of intelligence. So in a typical educational psychology textbook, you'll see John Carroll's sort of hierarchical organization of intelligence. You'll also see Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory. You'll see Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences theory. I have a little bit of a bone to pick with this anyway, because I think the data for the top two are much weaker than the data for the bottom one. But the larger bone I have to pick is if you present three theories, what is a teacher candidate to conclude? These theories are not compatible. These theories are not there, right? And again, if you're a scientist, you're like, well, of course they're not compatible. That's the whole point. But if you're a practitioner, what do you conclude from that? I submit what you conclude is no one really understands intelligence. No one really knows what's going on. And as far as theory is concerned, you're right. That's why there's debate. But there are empirical generalizations about intelligence. These three theories are all trying to account for the same data set. That we actually know, and for some of those data, we're fairly confident, right? That those data are right, they're replicable, and so on. All right, so I think the consequence of presenting and again, I would point out, if you're on the road to become a researcher, makes perfect sense. That you're like, here's the big picture of our research field, that you'd be exposed to all of these. I think if you're a practitioner, the consequence is you conclude, I guess I can, I'll pick the one that sort of resonates the best with what I already believe, or that I like because it sort of appeals to values I have. That's kind of what I want my classroom to look like, right? But that's up to me to pick which one. All right, so researchers expect competing theories. I suggest practitioners need one theory that captures important empirical generalizations. And again, isn't generating new predictions. That's not use of theories that practitioners need. Second, let's talk about that a little bit. Researchers expect theories to make novel predictions. I've said this a couple of times. Here's Karl Popper, every scientist's favorite philosopher of science. Those among us who are unwilling to expose their ideas to the hazard of refutation do not take part in the scientific game. You have to go out on a limb and say something that you do not know whether or not it's right, and that it can be disproven if you want to consider yourself a scientist, right? So theories must make novel predictions. Practitioners theories are needed that integrate known empirical generalizations. And so the way I think of this is that theories for educators should be boring to researchers, right? And I've seen this when I've been in the room where someone will present a theory, and a challenge is, tell me something that your theory, tell me a falsifiable prediction that your theory makes. Like this is capturing stuff that everybody already knows is true, right? You don't get points for, like, look, my theory predicts a negatively accelerating learning curve, right? The response is, well, a damn well better. Like, we've known for well over 100 years, every learning curve is negatively accelerating, right? So that's the kind of boring theory that will actually be useful to educators. So practitioners need extremely conservative theories. Finally, researchers need theories that employ precise constructs. That is a consequence of the need for making predictions. Right? If you're going to make predictions, you can't have a lot of hand-waving going on. You need the way that these different components are put together needs to be very well specified. That's how you end up with components in there like the episodic buffer that are kind of abstract and a little bit hard to wrap your mind around. This is something that I think practitioners don't need at all. Practitioners need models that are comprehensible. Right? The function that they're putting the model to is to help me remember all those empirical generalizations, the things we know about kids that we're pretty sure are right. So what I suggest is you should present simple models and also use folk psychological terminology when possible, when it's not really doing violence to the concept. So this is a model of the mind I used in one of my books. And I did use the term working memory because I thought this is so standard in our field, doesn't make sense. But very simplified what it is. This is the site of awareness and thinking. And then here I didn't say this is encoding, this is retrieval, which is what you would do if you were a psychologist, said this is learning, this is remembering, and so on. Right? So use everyday terminology if you can do so without doing violence to the ideas. So the big picture here, remember what we're this last fourth of the talk, I started off saying practitioners need empirical generalizations. Theories are going to get you in trouble. I'm now stepping back and saying theories, the way scientists use theories, are going to get you in trouble if you're a practitioner, or not trouble, but they're not going to be helpful. I'm now stepping back and saying you could do a different type of theory that would be useful to practitioners. And that's the idea here, that we should tie empirical generalizations with a limited number of what are generally called modal models. So modal model in psychology comes from this paper in 1967 by a memory researcher named Bennett Murdoch. It's called the modal model. This is a model of memory. And this is short-term memory, this is long-term memory, this is sensory memory, so I'm going to worry about that. This is attention, and then this is encoding and so on. The reason this is called the modal model, Murdoch was, again, this is 1967, Murdoch was noting there's so much agreement among memory researchers. If you took all the models that are out there and just took the most common features, you would have a pretty good model of memory. And he called it the modal model because it was like after the statistical measure, the mode, like the most commonly appearing number. So this is what I've described here. This is a version of the modal model. This is a modal model for memory or cognition. Very simplified, and again, very boring if you're a researcher. A researcher would say, of course, something like this is right. But I think this is very useful for teachers. I think Jim Gross has proposed one for emotion that would be another candidate for a modal model where you could hang a lot of empirical generalizations on this. So just very briefly, in Gross's model, you start off with a situation down here, so the broad context that the individual finds themselves in. Something happens. There's a reorientation of attention. Attention is now on the new thing that has happened. There's some appraisal of the thing that's happened, and this is where the emotional reaction is going to come in, and then there is some response generated, and then the response changes the situation. Right? So extremely simple, but once you flesh it out, this is actually helpful in thinking through many empirical generalizations about the nature of emotion. Okay, so researchers need theories that employ precise construct. Practitioners need theories that employ folk constructs where possible in the context of these simplified modal models. All right, so we're back here to the sort of top level of the organization. Theories for researchers versus theories of practitioners. We want theories that summarize, not predict. So this is a last slide, summary slide of ways in which I would think about changing practitioner education. I would focus on empirical observations made easier to understand and remember through boring theories. This is basically what I've been describing for the last hour. But there are a couple of other points I want to mention on, focus on. One is, or mention in passing, One is a focus on what these mean in classrooms. That's sort of obvious, but ought to be made explicit. And then finally, this is also obvious, but is not at all easy to do. You have to follow through. I think if there's any hope for this to be useful, this can't be a course that happens at the front end, and then this content is never revisited. Because these empirical organizations, these empirical generalizations, like limitations of working memory, they look different in different classrooms, right? So it caches out differently in a adolescent literacy class than it does in an early elementary math lesson, right? It's the same phenomena, but you're going to see different signs of it. And so especially as teachers sort of branch out and start to specialize more, they need to understand what this might look like in my context. And again, learning being what it is, this content has to be practiced if there's any hope that it's going to be remembered. So that's going to wrap it up. Here's your CLE credit. I didn't put this slide here. And I think, do we have like a few minutes for questions? Yeah, great. We have questions or comments, please. Yeah, and applause. Come at me, bro.
Yeah, we're back at it.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for presenting. So I really like the idea of providing the epistemic generalizations to teachers as sort of that guiding post. I know in some of your other works, though, you talked about like domain specificity, in particular higher order skills and critical thinking. As we're teaching teachers, I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts of like, there are things you know about reading or things you know about math that don't generalize across maybe each other.
Sure.
But how do you integrate that then within this framework? Again, maybe it's different for elementary school teachers because they're teaching everything versus a specialist teacher, but... Yeah.
No, that's a great... And did everyone hear the question in the back? Or for the people in Zoom, I think and tell me if this is a fair summary, that you are asking, there are empirical generalizations that are subject matter specific, and possibly, I've sort of said like, and it's going to be all ages, and you would say, guess what, I bet I can find some that are not applicable to all ages, and I would agree with you. And it seems clear to me. It's like, these courses are usually taught like in like first quarter or first semester or whatever it is. And so as you're moving along, you start to learn some of those more those generalizations that are more specific to either subject matter or the age group that you're teaching. Yeah, that feels right. Yeah. Yeah, please.
So we have not only future teachers in the room, but we also have those who want to build resources for teachers. And a lot of conversation happens about like, well, how do I package things for handing off to the teacher? And like, do you have any thoughts about how we frame like the theory of change idea in product development and instructional design as a way of doing this kind of like boring theory?
I understood everything until the last phrase, and then yeah, like theory of change. Yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about. So try me another way.
So when we need to start with research and science and
yes.
make it boring enough to make it convincing enough.
Oh, how do we do that? Oh, yeah. Well, like that's my career, dude. I mean, that's like, it's so. No, that's very challenging, and I'm fond of saying like, yeah, I spend like 15-20% of my time thinking about cognitive psychology, and the rest of my time thinking about that, of like how do you touch base with what people already understand and believe, and then say, here's another way of thinking about it that I think will be useful, and that's partly, really coming to understand how they're coming at what they see as a problem and how they're coming at that problem, and then also what they might have invested in their view of the problem and the way they've been dealing with it, and how you can kind of sneak up on that and offer an alternative. Because obviously, if you parachute into a classroom and you say, hi, I'm Dan, I've got a much better way to teach math, right? Like, you're going to get the reaction you deserve, right? Yeah.
So you mentioned a lot about how how kind of encouraging us to base our assumption or our approaches to theory on empirical observations in particular.
Yes.
But something that I was thinking about, especially when you were discussing how, like, you could have 3 theories that explain the same data set, is oftentimes I feel like, at least and maybe I should read more of like the deep like ed psych literature, but I feel like oftentimes the theories inform the way that the data is collected. So how do how does that kind of how do we account for that in
that's a great question. And this gets in, when I was talking with doc students before, this something like this came up. And this, I think, goes to the question of being both thoughtful and, in my view, pretty conservative about what you take to be an empirical generalization that you're ready to bring to teachers, right? Because you are literally saying, like, I think kids are like this, and I'm ready to stand behind that. And if it is the case that the way, yes, like there's a bunch of studies like that, but they've all been, they're all coming out of the same lab, and they're all people who have the same worldview or something, then I think you really ought to think carefully about that. Like these are generalizations. You want to see this in multiple different types of paradigms, data collected different ways, people who do have different perspectives sort of coming to the same conclusion, not about how to interpret the data, but about what happened, right? That's the difference between the empirical generalization and the theory. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Yeah.
I love the idea of thinking through like folk theories and sort of creating opportunities for sort of changing the language a little bit of theory to engage with practitioners. And I also think that I'm thinking about the students that I teach in our pre-service teacher education program, our master's students. I'm thinking about how fun it is to actually engage with theory and sort of have those conversations with theory.
Yes.
And I think about teachers as intellectuals themselves.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering about, like, where does that come into the process, right? Where teachers get to engage in the conversation around theory and also get to inform theory, right? So like the other question about when teachers' experience comes back and informs the theory.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I'm asked this sometimes, and my response is, to me that feels like optional and something that should be encouraged in teacher candidates who are interested in that. I feel like you should not need to master theory in order to be a teacher, because I don't think it helps you be a good teacher. I think understanding kids helps you be a good teacher, but I don't think you need to master theory, including, usually there's somebody who say, you mean to tell me they don't need to know Piaget? And I'm like, I'm ready to bite the bullet. They don't need to know Piaget to be an effective teacher. So I feel like that's sort of where I come down on that. Sure, lots of teachers are interested in that, and it's great. Well, God bless them, and let's encourage them and support them. But I don't think it's necessary. Yeah.
We have a question on Zoom. How can theories of learning be pushed out to those who are in the classroom now?
Well, I'm paddling as hard as I can. Pushing it out, that's should be what professional development is for, but that's a whole other issue, is how professional development is handled and its effectiveness. But yeah, I mean, the teachers who are in practice, obviously, they're busy and they've only got so much time. Fortunately, much of the high percentage of the people who are in the profession are, they're curious, they love it. This is what they're devoting their life to, and so they will, if you make it easy to access and make it, easy to access both literally and then also psychologically, they'll get after it, but it's an obstacle. People are busy. Yeah.
Given where the fields of psychology and teacher education are, do you have any sense of the number of generalizable observations and teacher-focused theories that we're talking about? I mean, you showcased 5 or 6 of these kind of observations, and you talked about a couple of these kind of bigger teacher-focused theories.
Yeah.
What's your sense of, how much are we talking here that is reasonable to bring to teachers based on the knowledge that we have on the research side?
I mean, I am making this up because I haven't, I mean, just to be candid, right? Yeah. Just to be candid. So this is very much a gut thing. I mean, I think right now this is a semester-long course in most places, or a one-quarter course. And it usually has a textbook that you can't possibly cover. You know, the textbooks are great in terms of the coverage of content and the extent to which they're up to date. I've made plain, like, I would do a quite different approach. So in terms of like what's present now, there's much more than could be covered in a semester. I think, I'm pretty sure you could do a semester on this if you limited yourself just to the types of empirical generalizations I'm talking about. I mean, I'm thinking really like this is really a defense of what I've been doing the last 20 years. This is mostly the way I operate. And like I've written about a lot of stuff, so like probably I could fill a course with it. That's what I'm basing this on. But I don't really know. Yeah.
So the way you describe that is that it would be professors might not want to profess that content to people who are going to be teachers. There's the application.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, they might not want to profess the content that I put big red X's next to. Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah.
So if you think about the design of teacher education and the staffing of
Yes.
teacher education, are there some implications that you've thought about for your work in terms of a redesign or a restaffing model of teacher education that might be more appropriate than the ones we have in place?
Redesign clearly. Restaffing, I don't think so. Because I mean, like what I've just described, like this is, and again, like every educational psychologist who I, would show this to would say like, yes, of course, like this is their bread and butter. This is right. So it's not like they would say like, oh my gosh, how am I going to teach that course? Let me go to my dean and ask for something else to do. Right. It's so that part, the staffing's easy.
Upstream, as they move through junior.
Yes,
Okay.
that gets serious.
Of the content initially, but later on, and now I've got to apply it. And this is what maybe the staffing model begins to think about. How do we make sure that that's staffed up there and they experience the kind of wherewithal, in the classroom?
And I think the issue is we are royalty in our classrooms. We really don't like constraints. And so I'll just tell a personal story. So like I'm in a psychology department, and I tried to get my fellow cognitive psychologists at the graduate level to agree to a curriculum. And like they weren't having it. They were like, they had all, and I'm like, guys, like the importance of it, like we figured it out. Like psychologists figured out that it's really important to have consistency and follow through. And they had all kinds of reasons that this didn't matter. But what it really boiled down to is like, I teach it this way. I'm very successful in teaching it this way. I love doing it right. And so, yeah, that gets serious when, and when I breezily say, and then like, if you're doing adolescent literacy, you need to like bring back like working memory and explain how that looks to teach. Like, the person who's teaching how to, that's where the issue is. The person may be like, it's not really my point of view. I don't really want to teach it that way. And that's serious. Yeah. And this gets back to the earlier question, like when you've got in-service teachers, how do you sort of reach them and convince them this is important, like this is what we have to do? It's exactly the same thing here. I'm suggesting that, all of us need to be thinking the same way.
So maybe one more question, or we wrap up? One more online? No?
Another Zoom?
Okay, one more. Thanks.
One more question on Zoom. How do we get the summary of the models you have described? Do you have any resources?
Yes. Next question. This isn't like put together for this purpose, but the resources exist, they're out there, but not packaged the way that I'm suggesting it would be useful to have it packaged. Yeah. Well, thanks for staying with me in the heat. Yeah.
I just want to thank everyone again for coming, whether you are faculty or staff or one of our wonderful alums or a member of our community, however you are coming to us, thank you for being here. Thank you again to Dr. Day for making this possible and for all your many contributions to education. And thank you again, Dr. Willingham, for your thoughtful and engaging talk.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.